but I have noticed that Gail has joined us. So, hi, Gail. We haven't had a chance to meet yet. I know we have plans to meet soon, but thank you for joining us today and being willing to share this presentation. I will let you introduce yourself a little bit to the group.
Okay, thank you. It's such a pleasure to be here with you. I don't know how many of you were involved some years ago when I was the executive director of Open Communities. Before that, the Interfaith Housing Center of the Northern Suburbs, and St. John's Lutheran was a wonderful member of Interfaith. And, you know, I have to say, I always loved it. I would get these checks once a year, you know, in like a little envelope for, I don't know, $157.61 or something like that from the collection, you know, because you all really cared about fair and affordable housing. And I did have a chance to speak to your group around peace and justice some years ago. So it's just great to come back. I'm no longer with Interfaith, but these days, for the last 2 years, I've been the executive director of housing opportunities and maintenance for the elderly or home, which started out also from faith roots as an offshoot of Little Brothers, what's now called Little Brothers Friends of the Elderly, focused on intergenerational housing for low-income older people in Chicago. So
I remember you from times when you came to Wilmette Lutheran Church, where I was a member.
Oh, that's right. Yeah. That was such a lovely church and a great congregation. Was that was also Barb Hiller's congregation, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
She was really hoping, I think, that we would give the parsonage to a housing, you know, but that was not the wish of the committee, and that just didn't happen. But
Thank you. Yeah, I know that she hoped that. I remember actually also with your congregation, do you still have a little house in the back? Because I remember a pastor at the time, Pastor McGinnis, I think his name was.
Yeah.
He had thought that perhaps renting that to a family with a voucher would be a good. I used to say that to congregations. If there's a member of a congregation who's a landlord, or the congregation itself, if you just rent one unit, convince one person to rent to somebody with a voucher, that's that many more units of affordable housing.
Yes, we do have an apartment building still behind the church. We have 2 units, and they're currently occupied, but that's a really neat idea of like, what if we decided to rent those to people who have a Section 8 voucher. That'd be amazing.
Yeah. So my understanding is this talk that I'm giving, or conversation we're having, is the kickoff to a series that you're doing.
Yeah, we have today and next week, we are talking about housing specifically. And so you're the first of those 2, but then we also have an even broader series that's just about dismantling institutional racism in general. So that began last week with Malika Gardner talking about Black History education expansion. And Dino Robinson is going to be part of it, talking about reparations in Evanston. So it's touching on lots of different forms of institutional racism. We're just trying to learn about some of the aspects that affect our life in the community of Wilmette. And so, yes, you're the first talking about housing. Yeah.
Well, great. Well, maybe I'll get started. So I know this is an hour. I'm gonna try not to take the full hour.
That'd be great. Yeah.
But
we can ask questions. Yeah.
So let's see. I can share. Good. I can share my screen.
Chris, she's bringing over her chili. No.
Okay, let me go all the way to the top here. Okay, slideshow. I'm beginning. What I'm going to do this morning in a very briefly is give you a sense of the history of how it is that our suburbs are very white, especially, particularly Wilmette, but most of them, and talk about how this was a situation that was a result of design and not actually intent. It's not that, Black people or people of color didn't want to live in the northern suburbs, but that the way these suburbs were created was part of essentially white flight out of cities, particularly after the war, World War II. And I'll talk a little bit about how fair housing, which is not discriminating based on race and other categories, is different from affordable housing. Because affordable housing is about price. One is the other is simply about, I have the money, but they won't let me in. And then I'm going to talk about some of the myths and facts about affordable housing and what has happened in Wilmette and what people can do today. Oh, I should mention that this graphic here, I wrote a chapter in a book called The Chicago Freedom Movement. I wrote specifically about the grassroots movement for fair and affordable housing on the North Shore. And this is from a brochure from 1965, which, oh, thank you. You've got the book.
I bought her book, and I believe Anne did as well. So it's an amazing book. It has a ton of essays. It's quite long, but Gail has an essay about the summer of 1965 and some great organizers in Wilmette. So read about our history. It's awesome.
Yes, and the epicenter of activity is Wilmette, and it's something to really be proud of. So what about Chicago's North Shore? You can see that Chicago's North Shore is overlaid over a map of Alabama, Montgomery, Selma, because those are directly connected. People who marched in Selma in the spring of 1965 came back and decided they thought about, well, what can we do right here at home? Well, what's the big issue here at home? It's not voting rights, but it's housing rights. So that's what that was all about. And you see the little symbol on the bottom here, the equal housing. I think that, we see that on real estate advertisements now. I think it really was born on with the North Shore Summer Project, which is what that campaign was called. So why we should care. This is from the Enterprise Foundation, which is a fairly conservative, entity, and it says, we should care about housing, about affordable housing, mixed income communities, because housing is a platform for stability and dignity in a family's life. So, regardless of your political views, you're going to come down in agreement that mixed income housing is important and diverse housing. The just reason, this comes from a Supreme Court, a New Jersey Supreme Court decision against exclusionary practices that says that new and different lifestyles and habits are the lifeblood of America. It's our strength. And just as diversity strengthens and enriches the country, so will it strengthen and enrich a suburban community. And then finally, the moral reason. This is a quote from First Congregational in Wilmette around the time Interfaith started, that, it's the very basic.
I come in and out.
Yeah, love our neighbor, concern for the structures of injustice and compassion. And I found this is actually, for those of you who knew Jean Cleland, who was the first housing commissioner in Wilmette back in 1980. She was also a member of First Congregational, and she was instrumental in getting Gates Manor, which is the low-income senior building in downtown Wilmette, built. She had done this testimony that talks about the importance of the Wilmette Plan Commission in recognizing a lack, I'm reading here, of adequate housing in the village for seniors, the young, and others with moderate or fixed incomes. And she talks about how this explicit language is clearly a moral expression of concern for the young and the old and the person employed in Wilmette, and that those persons who happen to have low and moderate incomes are nonetheless deserving of decent, safe, and reasonably affordable housing. For the generous and humane view taken by our village board at that time, all Wilmette citizens should be grateful. It's such a wonderful, gracious statement that really undergirds the fact that concern for all people is really part of the fabric of Wilmette, more than other suburbs, I have to say. Suburbs that I will not name, but it's the majority of them. So very quickly, too quickly that this could be a whole course, but how did our suburbs become so white? People don't know that history. More than, almost 3 out of 4 Americans believe that hard work should determine our success or has determined our success. But in fact, zip code is a better predictor of success, meaning that we're so segregated by race and income that even our life outcomes are actually determined by where we are born, where we live, as opposed to, who we are and what we've accomplished personally. So really there are 3 things that, that contribute to why we have the housing patterns of today. One is public policy. The other is racism. And then the third is that continuing perceptions, both of people of color and people, whites in our communities, perceptions continue to thwart efforts toward diversity. And I'll run through these fairly quickly. So for one, about racial segregation is unnatural, that actually you may not be aware that until 1900, most of our cities were actually integrated, but segregation policies were put in place. And a lot of this history comes from American Apartheid, which is the name of a book by a couple of Harvard professors, Doug Massey and Nancy Denton, from about 25 years ago. And they wrote about all the things that created these segregated patterns. One is transportation patterns with the railroads. Another is labor union prejudice. So why should that be connected to segregated suburbs? Well, simply you start a pattern of paying some people less than others because of their race. So that's where the confluence of race and class comes in. So Blacks were confined to ghetto neighborhoods, meaning like only let's say a few square blocks on the south or west sides of Chicago, while whites are able to access suburban areas. And Arcadia was a term that was used, a bucolic, like the English manor house. And that's what people were aspiring to in creating suburbs. Zoning is only about 100 years old. So deciding how to place housing, where factories go, where commercial districts are, began with the growth of our cities and suburbs. We had the issue of sundown towns, which is Kenilworth was actually officially a sundown town, where literally you could not, if you were Black, you could not live there, but you could work there. And you can see from this little clip, which I actually got from Dino Robinson. I know he's going to be a speaker for you. He and I worked together on a history of open housing on the North Shore about, in Wilmette, literally going after families that would sell or rent to a Black family. They could be there as a domestic, but they couldn't actually own or rent property. The concept of restrictive covenants, which was only struck down by the Supreme Court in 1948, which says you cannot sell your home to a Black person, a Jew, or whomever. There's some people who still, they look in their attic as the covenant for the covenant of their home, and it'll have that restriction. Of course, those are not enforceable, but they were there. And then restricting real estate listings, where real estate professionals would not show or sell homes in Wilmette or other communities to Black families. and they would steer them to communities like, for example, Evanston's Fifth Ward, where they could live, and steering of whites as well, steering of whites to communities. So really, everyone was kind of like a bunch of chess pieces. We were all sort of steered this way and that. So, and then after World War II, we were, GIs came back. There was a burst of prosperity, and our suburbs began to grow. So only 1/3 of Americans lived in suburbs in 1940, but today a majority, 52% of Americans live in suburbs. Suburbs were very white until, even as recently as 2000, 76% of suburbs were white, and now it's gone down somewhat to 68%, but it's still very highly white. And then again, how did that happen? The FHA, the federal government itself, and I have a little, you may not be able to read that in yellow, but it basically says that if a neighborhood looks like it'll, the undercurrent in this is that if a neighborhood looks like it's going to go all black or mostly black, we're not going to insure mortgages in those neighborhoods. And that's actually in the Federal Housing Administration's underwriting guidelines. Then, but the good news is there was a lot of pushback, as I mentioned in the very first slide. The North Shore Summer Project, energized. Think about today, if you can't imagine 1965, what's happened since the George Floyd murder with activism. So here, people seeing what was going on in Selma. So they start the North Shore Summer Project, which has a very intentionally similar name to the Mississippi Summer Project, except this is about housing. This is from a brochure that they had dramatizing racial segregation in, they have Winnetka, Evanston, Wilmette, Glenview, Highland Park, and Deerfield here. There was a lot of pushback from the realtors. They even tried to saying that you shouldn't bar people from even applying to buy a home or rent based on race. They tried to argue, they tried to do a referendum that said that the 14th Amendment, which is ironic given that it was around, anti-slavery, that the 14th Amendment gives an owner the right to sell to whomever he pleases. Needless to say, that did not prevail.
What, could you give us the date for that document?
I'm not sure. I'm going to guess that it's around in the early 60s. I'm going to guess it's around 65.
Okay. Yeah.
Yeah. And in 1965, this is the Winnetka Village Green. I took a picture. I went to the archives at UIC of the North Shore Summer Project, and the front page on the Tribune had this picture from the Village Green with 10,000 people hearing Dr. King and other civil rights activists basically say that you can't, we shouldn't have a country based on a democracy and based on all men are created equal and discriminate. And at the end of so this again is another thing that's hopeful, that says that the people in our suburbs, they may have been mostly white, but it doesn't mean that they were mostly racist. What the North Shore Summer Project did, these were volunteers, people from congregations. It was largely faith-based, and I talk about that in my chapter, that tried to reach all 2,000 people who had homes for sale on the North Shore in 1965 to see would they sell to a Black person. It turns out that most homeowners, an overwhelming number, didn't care about the race of the people that their home was sold to. And then they talked to the neighbors, people who were not selling their home, and how would they feel about having a Black neighbor next door? And even more of them didn't care. So when you're seeing here, the man here is Reverend Emery Davis, who was the chair of the North Shore Summer Project. All of these people were marchers, and they're presenting that report that says this to the realtors, justifying that, you know, it's realtors that were the gatekeepers and not in lockstep with their actual clientele. After, so in 1968, indeed, we did prevail. And after, unfortunately, with Dr. King's, it took Dr. King's assassination to pass federal fair housing laws. So it became the law of the land that you could not discriminate based on race, color, national origin, sex, religion, and then later disability and presence of children in housing. And also another part of the law that was passed said that all communities should take steps to integrate. That rules for that were not promulgated until 2015. And that's the thing, if people are wondering about, you know, when Trump talked about, you know, we can't have, you know, these rules, he was talking about trying to end rules that were passed with the 1968 Fair Housing Act. So what happened? So we got these laws passed, but why hasn't much changed? Well, briefly, lack of fair housing enforcement. The Fair Housing Act was not really enforced by HUD. Home rule, which was passed in 1970 in Illinois. So, you know, in exchange for enacting a an income tax statewide, home rule was enacted too, to allow suburbs to fund their own schools. And I did verify, this was a question in Northbrook when I gave this presentation. Illinois is 50th, the bottom of the 50 states in the amount of state funding that goes to public schools. So in other words, we're so largely funded by private property taxes that also contributes to a lot of the inequities, especially communities that don't want to add more children to the school system. And then the racial wealth gap obviously has grown since the 60s, which has a lot to do with deindustrialization, a lot of macro issues that we all know about, the wealth gap. Job migration too, many more jobs have moved to the suburbs, and outsourcing, those also contribute to the wealth gap. Housing policies haven't kept up with a lot of this movement and migration. Limited public transit is another issue that prevents people who are living in segregated Black neighborhoods from coming up even to their jobs in the northern suburbs. So that, I realize this is very quick, but you might have some questions. I'm glad to answer those. The second reason that our suburbs look like they do is really that race supersedes class, meaning that racial segregation has actually served to concentrate poverty and wealth. So when we have a situation where people are segregated, Black people here, white people here, instead of poverty being evenly distributed across communities and wealth, they end up being pushed to extremes. And you can see that in this graphic. I had pulled together data of the northern suburbs that shows affordable housing. So you can see here that, for example, you know, in 2011, I'll look at Wilmette here. Only 4.1% of Wilmette's housing was, I'll talk about what affordable means in a minute, but only 4.1% of our housing stock was affordable. Then I juxtapose that to what percent of our suburbs are both Black and Hispanic combined. And what I found was that if 10% is the threshold, the communities with under 10% affordable housing also have under 10% Black and Hispanic, compared to the other communities, Evanston, Highwood, Niles, and Skokie, where over 10% affordable housing is also over 10% Black or Hispanic. And then finally, and to me, this is a really, really important issue that is too often overlooked, is that perceptions thwart diversity. So the perception among everybody, actually, in a study that I worked on when I was at Open Communities that was funded by HUD, we were looking at perceptions of Chicagoans, Black, white, and Hispanic, renters and homeowners. How do they perceive our communities? And all of them perceive the northern suburbs as being exclusive and not welcoming. And certainly for Blacks, as you can see in this quote, I wouldn't feel comfortable living there. You already know you're not welcome because of the way they look at you. And it's not even really an income thing because they are out there struggling too. So, and this concept of comfort zone came up in the focus groups. And then from people who are, and from whites within communities, a lot of them, simply the presence even of a family portrait in a home, believe it or not, of a Black family can lower a sense of the value of the property and even a perception of the safety of the neighborhood. That was a stunning anecdote in a brief that I read by sociologists and social psychologists about fair and affordable housing. So perceptions stand in the way of a diverse community. So now I'm going to segue into affordable housing. And just very quickly, who needs affordable housing? What are we talking about? We're really talking about a mixed income community. So who are the people, in other words, who are left out or being pushed out? So one is older adults, seniors, who are on fixed incomes, who cannot keep up with accelerating costs. And waiting lists for housing that exists can be very long. People with disabilities, there may be some affordable housing in the community, but if they have stairs, you know, or they have additional barriers even to affordability that has to do with accessibility. Families with children, as I mentioned, when you have property taxes being so heavily, you know, 3/4 of your tax bill are supporting schools, a lot of our communities try to discourage new housing for families with children. And they try to target developments that are for young professionals or, quote, empty nesters. And we've seen that in Wilmette. Young adults need housing. A lot of, as we know all about student loan debt, our young people are paying exorbitant amounts for their housing, or else they have to experience long commutes. And then people who are simply paid less, you know, they're not any less valuable to the community, but they're not, you know, a Wall Street trader or an attorney or a brain surgeon, but we care about them. Teachers, nurses, social workers, clergy, artists, childcare workers, they need housing that is below the median. The benefits of affordable housing are, you know, that we are able to provide housing for those populations. We can allow our communities to accommodate people who are moving up or downsizing. So we can allow for movement within our community. We could increase diversity in our schools. We can better attract and retain employees, and if they're living affordable, people are living affordably, they can actually save money. So quickly, some of the myths and truths about affordable housing. I always say, don't ask the question, do you want affordable housing? Ask the question, do we want to be a community that accommodates families of any income level? So again, affordable housing is that people don't pay more than 30% of their income in housing costs. And these are the latest figures of what affordable is. So if you're talking about purchasing a home that is affordable, That is a home for a family of 4 that would be about $200,000. And if it's a rental, it would be about, for a family at 60% of area median income, it's about $1,200 a month. So that's not cheap, you know, I mean, it's not like dirt cheap, but it's lower than market. And so some of the myths and truths. So one is that affordable housing is really housing for Black people or for single moms or people with disability. You know, it's like this code word. No, affordable housing is based on income. It's not, these are people, by the way, in a home building. The big one is affordable housing lowers property values. That is, couldn't be further from the truth, but this is one of the most stubborn myths. And if I had to put my money on one myth that I would like really spend a lot of time debunking, it's that one. Affordable housing does not lower property values. Badly maintained housing of any stripe, you know, where people don't mow their lawn and everything is falling apart, and that lowers property values. The other is that affordable housing is large and unappealing. Well, no one is building anything like what you see on the left. That was torn down. That was Chicago public housing. Affordable housing looks more like what you see on the right, which actually is in Wilmette. That's the Village Green Atrium. It blends into everything else. Another myth is that affordable housing will raise taxes, but in fact, developers shoulder the cost. The Village of Wilmette, as far as I know, hasn't subsidized any affordable housing that exists in the community. Again, that individual communities would have to subsidize the housing. And no, the subsidies come from private sources. Another is that adding low-income children will lower school quality and force property taxes increases. But in fact, everybody benefits when you have diversity in your classroom, and it does not lower school quality or force tax increases. The other is that the people who live in affordable housing are on welfare, or they won't fit in the neighborhood. But that's not true either. A lot of the people who are living in affordable housing are already part of our community. They already work here, or they got a divorce, or they lost their jobs, or whatever it is that might be going on. They are us. Affordable housing does not increase crime. People who live in affordable housing are actually better vetted than even in other kinds of housing. And there's, again, no correlation between well-maintained housing for any income level and crime rates. Affordable housing does not contribute to traffic congestion. In fact, people living in affordable housing own fewer cars. Another myth is that it's seniors who are most in need of affordable housing in the suburbs, but that is not true. Seniors, as I showed you, are only one population in need. And then what does affordable housing look like? Well, I'm going to show you pictures of it right here in Wilmette. Shoreline Place, that is right across street from the Wilmette, from the Linden L stop. It's a beautiful building that was built to look like a Parisian building. You know, it's like a modern version of a building with a mansard roof. And it's a senior building. Gates Manor that I mentioned before in downtown Wilmette, beautiful building for low-income seniors, actually very poor. I'm talking here poorer than even the income levels that I showed you earlier. The Village Green Atrium, that's by the Wilmette Police Station on Ridge. And Malincrot, which we were so proud to have, that's a mixed income building, which we're especially happy about. I think that's a model for the future for Wilmette, a mix of incomes rather than 100% of any one thing. And moving into the history, because I know that you wanted to hear Wilmette's history. It all started over 40 years ago when there was a Wilmette Council for Senior Citizens that polled seniors about their need for housing that they could afford. This is what led to, in part, what led to Gates Manor. And again, this is part of Gates Manor and also what was called the Wilmette Housing Assistance Program. It's now become something called Housing Our Own. But Wilmette had a tiny portion of 1% of its budget dedicated to helping seniors and then later people with disabilities to afford their rent and mortgage and tax costs. And group homes, some of you might remember there was a big controversy about group homes in Wilmette. It almost went down, you know, people saying that people with disabilities in group homes will bring down the community, but Wilmette adopted, you know, very, very progressive rules allowing for group homes. And then mixed use for Malincrot, which I was part of. I'm in this picture with my children at the time. And I don't know if you remember Heather Van Deventer. She was the pastor, the associate pastor at St. Augustine's Church, and next to her is Mimi Ryan. We pulled together a whole campaign to make sure that Malincrot included some affordable housing in it. And we were very successful. It was a very exciting campaign. And then I was part of Wilmette Cares. We were a little group that tried to make sure 611 Green Bay Road included affordable housing. We didn't succeed there, but the trustees listened to us and got the developer to put money into the Housing Our Own fund for that I mentioned that subsidizes individual low-income people. And, you know, I don't have a picture of it, but the League of Women Voters has since been very active. A lot of people with Wilmette Cares around housing policy and establishing a Human Relations and Housing Commission in Wilmette. So how would you support an inclusive and diverse Wilmette? Well, you know, doing like what we have at Malincrot, make sure that any new building includes a mix of incomes, not just luxury housing. And even not just low income housing. It should, all housing should be, have a mix of incomes. An affordable housing trust fund, maybe expand Housing Our Own to allow for more uses for to support both people and structures. And then as I mentioned here, just educate people about the myths and the facts. The latest thing is you can be very proud again about all the great advocacy work that's happened just over the summer, culminating with just this week, just a few days ago, the village board approved recreating the Housing Commission, which oversees, you know, affordable housing policies and programs, and then a Human Relations Commission. And I love it how, you know, it's sort of funny. It's like Housing Commission, there are currently 7 vacancies, meaning like we've restarted and we're looking for like everybody. And the same with the Human Relations Commission. And I was involved in providing some information to the village as well, and the League of Women Voters about reestablishing both these commissions. Human Relations deals with just what that says, promoting people of all backgrounds in the community, doing some nonviolent conflict resolution, handling hate crimes, doing some of that. Like I said, perception is reality. So promoting Wilmette as an open community is, it would be the work of the Human Relations Commission. And you can go, the village is directing people to just submit their application. There's a talent bank questionnaire. So please, be great to have somebody in your, and also a person of, you know, religious leader, I think should be on certainly the Human Relations Commission, if not both. And so, you know, again, this is a very positive time. It seems that, you know, there's a lot of division, but we're also coming together because we aspire to you know, I love the metaphor of the beloved community that Dr. King talked about. And that's really what we're looking to do. The picture on the bottom comes from the Winnetka Green of 5 years ago when we started something called the Justice Project to promote the welcoming community. And this was a wonderful thing. Some of you may remember when the Wilmette had a Human Relations Commission before and promoted unity and diversity. It was a wonderful banner and logo. And finally, you know, how is a village a village? By including young and old, white and black, rich and poor, churches and shops. So this concludes my presentation. Maybe I'll stop sharing. And this is my email. I can always, I'm happy to share with you, and Pastor Allison has my contact. I don't know, Pastor Allison, if you were going to ask.
Yeah. Thank
moderator.
you so much. Yeah, that was fantastic. So I would love to open it up for questions. What questions do people have for Gail based on her presentation?
I'd like to add something to the history. I'm glad that Jean Cleland was mentioned because I'm aware of part of the things that she worked on, and one of them was joint housing. There was a house that was going to be having older people, older adults who were unrelated, living together. And there was even something worked out with Lutheran Lutheran Home in Arlington Heights, where they would get nursing assistance. And Jean helped work on that committee. It took 2 years to finally get the board to pass something, but there is something on the books. I'm not aware of what it is exactly, but where, for instance, a half a dozen older adults who are unrelated could live together in one home. And she was responsible for that, or partially.
Yes, at Interfaith, we had this wonderful program, which unfortunately, you know, I left 4 years ago, and unfortunately my successor got rid of it. That was the program. We called it home sharing, where we matched people looking for affordable housing with people who had an extra bedroom in their homes. And most often they were older people, but it worked out. We called it a win-win because the older person could get small rent or some assistance and companionship, and the other person could, live in the community. But Jean definitely was a champion of that.
I have a question in general. Like, how do you think the sentiment is today in Wilmette or North Shore communities versus, when you first started as far as pro affordable housing? Like, do you think it's on the upswing, on the downswing? It's just been neutral for years. I mean, where do you feel we sit right now?
Yeah, I'm glad you asked that because I smile because it's on the upswing. I mean, I used to feel a little bit marginal. I mean, there were the usual suspects. There was, Jean and other folks, but it always felt a little bit, I mean, we always thought that maybe we were really there was a silent majority there. Maybe we were the, percentage that was always a stalwart for affordable housing. And then there was that silent majority, but it always felt like a heavy lift. But today, even the fact that after the George Floyd, that there were 4,000 people spontaneously, joining in pledging to help work for a more inclusive and welcoming community and looking at housing, like there's no way we could have gotten 4,000 people years. And the Northbrook Village Board, like they were so against doing an affordable housing plan, and now they're poised to pass the strongest affordable housing ordinance, even stronger than Highland Park's. So I feel like there is a sea change, and Wilmette too, I think, even in reconstituting these two commissions and looking at, taking a new look at inclusionary zoning, I feel like there's more of an appetite for it. I just hope it doesn't, fade away.
Do you know why the home sharing thing faded away? Why that program was discontinued?
I think it's because the person who took over from me, he was worried about liability, even though home sharing started in 1985, and we had run that program for 40 years or 35 years or so. He thought, what if there's a problem in a match, and then who gets sued? Even though, again, the home sharing agreement was between the two parties. I think that was part of a big part of the concern was liability. Also, to be honest, the numbers were starting to go down. People were using Craigslist more. They were, looking instead, and even though we were free, and had the person with a social work background doing the matches, the ability of people to go online and do their own was one issue. But still, then they'd come back to us because then they were the victim of a scam, So I still hope that we can, that somebody can start home sharing again.
Gail, could you explain briefly, unless it's too complicated, Wilmette choosing to be a home rule community? I understand one of the positives was that then they could use their their real estate taxes to support schools. But how does Wilmette being a home rule community affect its obligation to follow Illinois mandates about affordable housing percentages?
Yeah, thank you for that. Good question. So first, Wilmette is home rule because of the population. It's over 25,000. So that automatically makes it home rule. Some communities, it's interesting, as soon as the state passed the Affordable Housing Planning and Appeal Act, and I actually sit on the enforcement board for that act. That act was passed in 2003, saying that every community in Illinois should have at least 10% affordable housing and should create plans to get to that point. There were communities like Winnetka, and I think Lake Forest was on one. There were several that suddenly passed referenda to become home rule, that had under 25,000 people. They didn't say it was because of that act, but that was pretty much the reason.
Yeah.
But the act is actually neutral on home rule. I mean, all the act says is the lack of the affordable housing crisis affects everyone in the state. It affects businesses. It affects families. We should all be concerned. Every community should have should have affordable housing. So clearly, when you look at the intent, it's like for everybody. But a number of communities, Wilmette being one, just about all of them on the North Shore have been saying, well, we're home rule. We don't have to abide by this law. And so the irony of that is that actually home rule gives you more tools, in fact, to comply. If you've got home rule, you can create an affordable housing trust fund. You can do a community land trust. You can partner with another community. That's the other wonderful thing about that act. Wilmette could partner with Glenview if it wanted, or Kenilworth or Winnetka together to do affordable housing. And home rule allows that, and this law allows that kind of partnership to happen. But the law is very, very weak. And a community that doesn't submit an affordable housing plan because they say they're home rule, there's nothing that the state can actually do to compel them to submit a plan the way the law is written. So all we can do, all you can do, is to say, we don't care about what this law says. We think it's the right thing to do. We think Wilmette should make sure that every new multifamily development is a mixed income development.
Thanks
I
for
have a
clarifying
question.
that. Okay.
Oh, yeah.
Get it.
I have another question. Who decides what the threshold is for affordable housing? You mentioned $200,000 home or $1,200 in rent. Does it index for inflation, or is it just set and left, or how did that come about?
Yeah, it's set, that number is set annually by HUD. So the US Department of Housing and Urban Development, because it administers a number of affordable housing programs, obviously has to state a number. So what they do is they look at every city, every metropolitan area, and the census, and they look at what is the median income, what they call the AMI, area median income, for families of different sizes. So in the Chicago area, the area median income is roughly $80,000 a year. So the state took that figure, or they figure, okay, everybody agrees to this standard that's used. We're going to decide what affordable means. So the state of Illinois decided that 80% of the median, which is roughly, let's say $60,000 to $65,000 a year, will be what we're looking for an affordable home for sale. So that $200,000 home, affordable to somebody at around $60,000 to $65,000 a year. And then, given that renters earn less generally, than homeowners, they decided on the 60% figure, which is about between $40,000 and $45,000 a year. So in summary, the metric is annual by HUD, but the decision for how to define affordable in terms of this act, the state act, was decided by the state.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I'd like to mention something I noticed as you were flipping through your slide presentation, that the poster, white race was depicted as pink. And I've been thinking a lot of this recently, as we're all thinking about color in this way. And one of the phrases I came up with, because my mind does go to the humorous very often, I'm also a writer, so I came up with this line: I'm pink, but I'm white enough to admit it. And then I started thinking about, because I'm a sun person, I started thinking about all the other colors that I turn during the summer, and as it fades, and now I'm old, and so even when I tan now, some of the same surfaces are unevenly covered. And just because white is a more neutral color, in actuality, we are just as much pink.
Yeah, that's great. One thing that I like to talk about these days is that we're not necessarily talking about, we talk about, in essence, assimilation, people assimilating into a certain culture. But the more time has passed, the more I start to think about, well, are we really talking about assimilating all these colors and races, or are we talking about how we can all together create something better? And I think that's really the direction that we're moving into. It's not just the different colors, but how do we enrich our community with the diversity that we are?
Well, one of the things I was trying to get at is that even by being basically white, we all have these other colors going on with us all the time. So whether we admit it or not, it, you know, browns and blacks and reds and yellow. I mean, for a long time, I thought my family might have American Indian to them, when in fact, that's not what it was. I saw a travel show and I saw these people from the Mediterranean, and I saw they were fishermen and out in the sun like my dad would get in the summer when I thought we might be Indian, because that's the same color that he turned. And I know we have this Mediterranean stuff. I mean, we all have all this parts of us in it. And
I'd like to get in another question before we run out of time. You mentioned that there's a law in Illinois that says that each community is supposed to have 10% affordable housing. Okay, I'm on the right track. And that then each community was supposed to submit some sort of plan. What is that plan called?
Yeah, it's called an affordable housing plan.
Okay.
So, right.
Yeah. So then, is there anyone proposing that maybe Wilmette create an affordable housing plan / has one already been created? Like, where are we in that kind of process?
Yeah, I'm again glad you asked. So Wilmette, so when the law was passed, most communities actually did comply. But every few years, like after 10 years, they had to do a new plan. So what's happened is Wilmette has a plan on the books that it passed in 2004, I think, into 2005, but it has refused to update its plan, saying that it's home rule. So the plan that if you look on the books, the affordable housing plan that Wilmette has is old and is not considered up to date by the state. So the League of Women Voters and others, we've tried to get Wilmette to update its plan, but you know, again, they've said that they're home rule. So I think the plan was due June 28th. So you might want to certainly push for, you know, the time for saying that, you know, your home rule is passed here. We need a real plan.
Right. Well, and I like what you said about like, let's just like bypass the whether it's required or not and just be like, well, we don't really care if it's required or not. Let's make a plan because we care about it. That's really cool.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, as I said, most of the activity lately has been through the league. So I don't know if any of you is a league member, or I can put you in touch with the league president.
They are the ones speaking next week.
Oh, they are. Okay. Yeah. Good. Yeah.
Cindy Levine and someone else from the league.
Cindy Goldstein.
Cindy
Goldstein.
Or Carolyn. I think it's Carolyn Goldstein.
Sorry, Caroline Goldstein.
Carolyn Goldstein and Cindy Levine are
yeah.
speaking with us next week. So we will hear from them. Yes. Perfect segue. You did part 1, so you led us right into part 2 next week.
Yeah.
You know,
Well planned.
So please do return next week. We will be hearing from the League of Women Voters to talk about their work with affordable housing in Wilmette. And they are going to give us more of an update on present day. So Gail has given us a really great insight into the history and brought us to present day. And now the League of Women Voters next week is going to go a little deeper into present day, what the status of the affordable housing units that we have right now are, and the practices, and then also what is going on at the village level, what is going on with these commissions that are being rebirthed, and what do we need in terms of an affordable housing plan. So they are going to be talking with us. They're going to pick up with all of those questions next week. So please, everyone, hope you will join us. And thank you so much, Gail, for being here with us today.
Thank you, Gail.
Thank you.
Thank you, Gail. Thank you. It was
Thank you.
fantastic. Appreciate it.
Yeah.
Thank you. for having me. You know, it only, like Margaret Mead says, it only takes a few people to change the world. I believe it.
Right? There's
Well, you're
something
one-
about like some people are when you wonder if only a couple people can change the world, and it's like actually that's the only thing that ever has.
Yeah.
is, you know, like a couple good people, you know. Um,
Well, you're one of them, Gail, so please keep up the great work you're
Oh,
doing. Thank you.
Thank
for
you, Anne.
sharing it with
Thank
us.
you.
And Michelle, thank you for the book recommendation.
yes, I'm looking at it now. The Color of Law.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a
Our-
great book.
Yeah, our book club read it. We just had one of the best discussions we'd had in years. It was
Good.
really,
Good.
really eye-opening for all of us. And, you know, it was not what you think it is. So, at least for me. So take a look at it if you're interested in the history of the topic nationwide.
Yeah.
Thank you. Have a good day,
Thank you.
everyone.
Have a good
Thank
too.
you. Bye.
Bye.
Bye.